Okay, let's start. So today we have two paper presentations by Leon and Yunsun, respectively, but we'll do that after I finish off the lecture. Also, one other thing I wanted to mention is that actually over this quarter, there are several good talks relating to this area, and one which is coming up is next Thursday, actually. And let me see if I can locate that. Yeah, here you go. So it's in the CS department. Yeah, so secure hardware platforms for IoT. In fact, in some ways, it preempts some of the things that I was planning to cover in one of the lecture, and the speaker is one of the topmost researchers in that space. So you've often heard me refer to secure hardware enclaves, and there are modern processors have this capability that you can kind of run outsourced computation securely without even trusting the OS. So Srinivas Devdas, he has been doing on the academic side at least a lot of the work in this space, including kind of finding weaknesses and all, and in general, sort of security primitives in the hardware that we'll talk later about. Anyway, so if you are free in the 2 to 4 slot, check it out. I think it's a good talk. The other talks in the quarter are actually as part of the Postel Distinguished Lecture Series in CS, which unfortunately coincides with our course time. So we'll see. There are two interesting security talks there as well. Okay, so let me finish the few remaining slides I had from. We were covering implants and vehicles, and we were kind of on the vehicle side of things. And the very last thing I was covering was that how the network itself becomes a vector of attack. And in particular, I had talked about that most of the vehicles out there, almost all of them, basically make use of these embedded computers called ECUs, and they are connected through a variety of different networks are present in cars, but the most dominant one for connecting the ECUs is the CAN bus and control area network. And the ECUs, besides the engine, as their name kind of implies, also essentially they're tasked with any sort of sensing or actuation kind of stuff. Lately, some things have begun to change. Firstly, some car vendors don't appear to use CAN bus, or at least don't expose them. Or don't use them for the same purpose. Mostly electric vehicles are in that direction. So I think the standard sort of was more for internal combustion engine, but also I think beginning to see Ethernet and all these kind of things. But also there are new standards for car networks emerging to also sort of carry high rate data, primarily because of entertainment, cars which have backseat entertainment displays and stuff like that, but also some of the sensors are pretty high rate as well, cameras and radars and things like that. So CAN bus is sort of obsolete, and in coming years will get replaced by kind of these high rate gigabit per second kind of variants. But for now, most cars have this, and as we kind of saw that this was designed, the characteristics of this bus are designed for under the assumptions that no one is going to hack onto it. I mean, simply put, so all nodes trust each other. The basic mechanism for being able to transmit over the bus is also one which can easily be a greedy node can easily kind of take over the bus. There is no authentication, there is no encryption, none of those things are kind of done. So it's very easy to mount a whole bunch of attacks that sort of I shown last time. And moreover, the bus itself is exposed through a very convenient connector, which is how sort of the mechanics work with the car, or your testing of smog emissions, those kind of things are also done through that. And you can buy little adapters to kind of get, I guess, nominally they are for getting information out of the car, but if and the ones and the settings which are to control the car are usually obscured, but reverse engineering is has been done extensively. So for a lot of cars, this kind of information is already kind of out there to be able to do it. So you can hack your way in, and there are all sort of attack scenarios that you can imagine. Okay, so that's what we had done last time. Another attack vector in cars which has received a fair bit of attention lately are the sensors themselves, and I had made some mention of it in the introductory lecture, but let's do a bit deeper dive into this thing. So cars have sensors for a variety of purposes. There are sensors which are for the internal state of the car. So for example, the health of various things, or I had described one of the attacks in the introductory lecture from my group where we attacked the anti-lock brake system. So again, is the wheel slipping, those kind of things, orientation, altitude, fuel level, all sort of things. Then there are sensors which are about the state of occupants, and I guess the one which is present in most cars nowadays is the one which detects whether there is anyone in the passenger seat or not, and then disables the airbag accordingly, or at least measures the weight. It was put there as a safety thing, primarily because sort of younger people setting their kids and all, they get hurt by the airbag apparently. So I guess there's some sort of a control mechanism that sort of kicks in there. But in recent times, we are also seeing more interesting sensing kind of emerging. Some of them are actually driven by safety considerations themselves. So this mostly has to do with, is the driver paying attention? Is the driver fatigued? In some cases, the driver drunk? Those kind of things. And the autonomous vehicles, or these kind of semi-autonomous vehicles, are the one which are using them the most. So for example, I think there is a new Cadillac CTS which came out in the recent Detroit Auto Show, and also there's an Audi, and these guys are claiming kind of a much higher degree of autonomous driving. I think one of them, I think it's the Cadillac, literally allows you to, you can be in the back seat, you can do whatever kind of stuff. That's what their claim is. But then what they do is they have cameras and other sensors to make sure sort of, no, let's see, hang on a sec. I think it's the Audi which allows it, but they kind of monitor the state of the driver. So while you can take your hands off, unlike, let's say, the Tesla, where you have to keep putting your hands on repeatedly, you can be off the thing, but still sort of be paying attention to the road in the front. That's kind of the idea out there. So lots of sensors like these. And each one of these you can imagine attacking and therefore bypassing the safety issue. Vehicles external state, so what are the nearby cars, is there a pedestrian nearby, animals, obstacles, things like that. And this kind of sensing is tricky as is, and because of environmental factor, biofouling and those sort of things, but also has been a subject of a lot of attack attempts in recent times. I mentioned that how attacks on machine learning algorithms, which kind of are recognizing what's happening in the scene. So a fair bit of work from various groups lately has shown that you can manipulate, subtle manipulation to the road signs so that the car reads them wrongly. So I guess the idea is at some point the cars will recognize there is a stop sign, and if there is a stop sign it will stop, and if there's a speed limit it will obey that. So if we can mess with those signs so that the humans either don't notice at all, or like for example some tiny sticker on the sign, or some other alterations which kind of are designed to fool the human. Human continues to believe it's right, but the car gets mistaken. So there are many ways to now attack the sensors. So sensors themselves are dependent upon computation. So one obvious attack vector is to attack the firmware which is responsible for processing the sensory data. So our CAN, bus, and all can help there. Injecting corrupted signal, so somehow corrupting the signal that the sensor is receiving to begin with. And then finally, physical alteration and fouling, which is if your car is dependent on some sensors, we stick something on the lens or the radar, or just kind of, these things usually jut out, so just changing their orientation a little bit. There is a fair bit of calibration and all that goes on, so if you mess with the calibration, including the physical positioning, then again you can impact these things. So let's look at some of the examples which people have talked about. So wireless tire pressure monitoring systems. So I mentioned last time that in many cars, the tire pressure is sensed by a little sensor, which is kind of part of that knob which goes onto the stem through which you fill the air, and then they wirelessly kind of talk to the ECU inside the car. Or there are other ways of measuring the car speed as well, but measuring the tire pressure as well. One other way which is used is to measure the difference in rotational speed of different wheels for the same distance traveled, and that gives you a tire pressure. So many attacks can be imagined. The weaknesses in these systems are very much along the lines of what we saw in the medical system. So firstly, the communications are based upon reasonably simplistic schemes. And the protocol usually not encrypted. So spoofing, battery drain attacks, all these kind of things are easily mounted. Moreover, their range is reasonably significant, that the adversary could be in a nearby car, on a roadside, or those kind of things. And then the papers which have emerged in the state on this thing have the kind of attacks they have been after is privacy related things. So you could imagine tracking specific vehicles because each pressure sensor has a unique ID. Also, I think one of the papers also speculated that you can design bombs, roadside bombs, which will explode for a specific car, and also essentially whatever in urban warfare kind of settings and all, you can design things which will go off when a specific car passes by and not otherwise. So it kind of helps the bad guys. There are potentially other kind of things that might be possible with this also. So in some cars, a sudden drop in air pressure for one of the vehicles at the very least can confuse the driver, and in some cases the car also takes kind of defensive actions against such measures, so that can again kind of cause chaos or confusion just at the right time. So this is kind of even a very simplistic device. And now imagine that some of the protections, some of the things are obvious. I mean, unique ID and those kind of things. How would can you imagine some way to take care of the unique ID problem? Kind of this targeted bomb situation. So how would, if you were designing this sensor, what would you do? I mean, on one hand, you do want to make sure that the car wants to make sure it's receiving from a specific sensor and not just some random reading. No ideas? No one? Come on. We talked about an approach last time, and we were talking about keys and immobilizers and rolling codes. Yeah, right. Rolling codes with an encryption on top, right? So that each packet looks different, and yet you have encryption. So that's the properly designed. That's a reasonable technique to kind of address this thing. Okay, so next up, when it comes to attacks on sensing are attacks on GPS. You could view them as attacks on wireless, so it kind of fits under both categories. So attacks on GPS fall into many categories, much like attacks on wireless would. So one is jamming, and that is fairly cheap and easy to do. Like any wireless signal, but particularly for GPS, because the signal coming to the receiver is pretty weak because the satellites are obviously quite far away. So there is a whole market for GPS jammers which is out there. I guess I went to eBay and couldn't find much because I guess US authorities, perhaps eBay being an American company, hammer down on them more aggressively. But if you go to Alibaba, there is no shortage of all sort of jammers which are there, and they are often marketed as to ensure your own privacy, but they are also being used by, for example, truckers or to kind of essentially avoid, well, in some cases, cheating on toll or freight charges that are charged by the amount of road you travel, insurance issues, those kind of things. So there are a bunch of things, and they are pretty convenient, tiny. I mean, this is one. This is a cigarette lighter thing. You just plug into your car, and it essentially creates a bubble around your car, or supposedly just around your car to prevent GPS signals. But it turns out that many of these things actually end up having a much larger interference zone. Other uses for these bypass drone flying restrictions. So in this country and many other countries, lately governments have begun to issue requirements where and when drone can fly. In particular, if you are within a certain distance of some kind of airport or helipad or something, then there are all sort of notifications, requirements, and permissions and stuff like that. So the latest firmware on consumer drones like DJIs, they basically, since the drones already have GPS and this information of where the maps, where the airports are, is well known, so these drones refuse to fly. And so being able to bypass has become kind of something drone owners want to do. So it's cheap and easy, but as you might guess, it's also illegal and can be quite dangerous. There has been incidents where people who are using it to create this privacy bubble or not tracking, not let things track and all, have caused interference with the landing systems of aircrafts and stuff like that. And in theory, the penalties are pretty steep, all the way to getting jailed. To what extent it happens is a different aspect. So that's jamming, and that's easy to mount. Next up in sophistication is spoofing. So spoofing refers to that somehow we manage to pretend as if we are a valid GPS satellite, and then manage to give the receiver a different impression of the range. And then once we compromise the range, or if we are mimicking multiple satellites in multiple ranges, then we manipulate the location inference that the receiver is doing. Now, it used to be until 90s that the civilian GPSs, the error range was quite large, so they were not very useful. But then this so-called selective availability was, the restrictions were removed by Bill Clinton, and after that, now the precision has improved and keeps improving through a variety of technological advances that they are being used in very critical applications as well. In fact, just this 2017, Broadcom came out with another GPS chip which supposedly claims 1 meter type accuracies and also might be able to work indoors, and we'll probably see them in our phones in the next year or two. So rapid improvement from what used to be 100-meter type accuracy to kind of 1 meter kind of accuracy. But there is an Achilles heel. So GPS has two channels, two ways of working. There's a military mode where the signals are encrypted and digitally signed, so they're authenticated, but the civilian channel is not. It's out in the open, and anyone can spoof it or mimic it. So there are widely available signal generators, and but you still need to mount the attack in a careful manner. You can't simply, if you were to simply pop up and start transmitting a signal, and if that satellite was already being received by the receiver, then the receiver will say, okay, this must be an attack, right? So you want to mount these attacks so that receivers with sophisticated algorithms are not able to detect them. Okay, so not just attack, but do it in a subtle manner, in a manner which is non-detectable. So a group out of Cornell, and then that person is now the faculty at UT Austin, and these guys in recent years have mounted quite a few attacks, and then also a group out of ETS Zurich. So these are a couple of research groups. And the basic strategy, the way it kind of works, is that you first, so you are receiving, you're as an attacker, you will receive the real satellite signal also. So presumably you are in the same general vicinity to be able to do it, so that you are getting a similar signal. And then you arrange your attack signal, as this kind of figure is showing. So the red is attack signal, blue is a real signal. You arrange your attack signal to align with it in phase. Okay, so you keep your signal sort of, since you're receiving the real thing, you kind of keep moving, and it kind of requires some additional information, because the phase of the blue signal that you are receiving and the phase of the blue signal that the target is receiving is going to be slightly different, because unless you are at the target, in which case kind of the attack becomes simpler. So you have to know some additional things, and if the target is moving, then you have to again do some additional manipulations. But conceptually, the idea is that you first learn the phase, and then you start building up the attack signal. Your attack signal is going to be initially very weak, but then it will become stronger, and at some stage it will then overpower the blue signal, and then the receiver will latch onto it. Receiver has no way of, at this stage, I mean, these receivers are designed to basically track the strong signal. So that's what would happen. And this group out of Austin, they showed some pretty high-profile attacks where they showed like commercial yachts and all kind of just going away from their designated trajectory. They've shown on drones, military aircraft, all kind of stuff. So, so in case of cars, it obviously opens up all sort of challenges, because many of the autonomous vehicles in particular are relying on GPS together with indexing into the map and all. And even otherwise, for a human driver and all, it can cause significant confusion between the instructions being given. And so that's spoofing.
In terms of the difference between the civilian and military GPS, is there any difference in the signal other than it's being encrypted?
Oh yeah, there is. So firstly, military signals are transmitted on multiple frequencies, and the idea is that that helps you cancel some of the atmospheric effects also, so they actually get more precision out of that. And more robustness to environmental perturbation. So essentially, they send it to two frequencies, and some of the frequency dependent effects, you are now able to cancel them. So that was the idea. Now, having said that, people have found all sort of ways to achieve similar improvements in performance while still staying in the civilian domain. So they typically do it by either making use of information across two civilian receivers and then comparing them. So there are all sort of other ways you can get the information and then compensate for it. So you'd be surprised, but just remaining in the civilian domain, people have achieved millimeter accuracies. Okay, yeah.
Did they add artificial noise into the system as well?
They used to. That's what got canned in 1990s. So there was a deliberate Gaussian noise which was added, and that got cancelled. The thing is, there were again ways to bypass it. Firstly, you can cancel it over time, stuff like that. I think they still add some amount, but it's a lot less. I think that was kind of the change. So there is some amount still going on, but again, there are creative ways to bypass it.
So sorry, is it predominantly the signal that increases the precision of the military, or is it the hardware on the receiver end as well?
I don't know. I suspect not. Although you will see that there's some attacks which attack the hardware also. Yeah, there's some interesting I don't think so. I think the military one perhaps just would require more sophisticated algorithm, but I haven't seen any indication that that in itself is anything. What is changing is there are newer satellites going up, and all sort of stuff happening. There, the stated goal is that so the agency which kind of that anywhere on the planet you should have location down to centimeters or millimeters and timing down to sub-nanoseconds, and indoor or outdoor wherever you are. But we are some years away from that. Now the thing is, as this thing has become is being used for critical purposes, so there is a tension which is going on, which is you in the normal course you do want civilian applications to make use of it, but during wartime you want to make sure your adversary don't benefit from it, right? I mean, so that was the original idea behind the selective availability. I guess at this stage that concern hopefully is less so, because all potential adversaries, Europe, China, Russia, they all have their equivalent systems at this stage. So there are multiple systems out there. So it perhaps doesn't really matter. So some of these things.
Quick question. So because there's like multiple different systems, do they ever like talk to each other, or are they?
No, the satellites don't talk to each other, but the receivers which talk to all of them and get their improved accuracy.
Okay. You can mix and match.
You can mix and match. Your availability at the very least goes up, but you can actually also get better accuracy. In effect, you have multiple location sensors, and by fusing them, you can get a more reliable reading. Yeah. And then there are also certain localish systems, like India operates one just over the South Asia one. So there are sort of systems which are global in coverage, and there are systems which are just covering part of the planet as well. Okay, so lots of demonstrations of successful spoofing, and in fact, some of the articles and all report that this kind of activity they are seeing very commonly. I think I'd mentioned that Red Square area in Moscow, apparently you're there and it kind of puts you off far away, miles away, and there are many other such reported incidents. Now there's another type of attack which is called the Meaconing attack. It's a special case of spoofing in a way, but basically the idea is that I'm not going to bother spoofing the signal entirely, but all I'm going to do is I'm going to delay the signal, a valid signal, and then transmit it, retransmit it, okay, and then cause confusion. So even a tiny amount of delay can cause a lot of havoc, but typically in these systems, you would have some sort of a digital delay line so that you can kind of mess with these things and then again cause problems. So in this case, the kind of attacks you can imagine are you can lure UAVs into an undesired area and essentially ambush them. So initially it was thought that it's not possible. Then that will be detected and all. Then this episode happened with Iran, where they commandeered a drone which was in Afghanistan and caused it to land in Iran and claimed that is what they did. And initially, kind of this was dismissed, but then the same Cornell groups, Cornell and UT Austin group, and showed that they are able to replicate this. Okay, so it's a feasible attack, and basically, even though it got mounted on the military drones, it was a combination of jam the military channel, the GPS then falls back onto the civilian one, and there you are able to do these attacks. Other things, have bombers attack a wrong location, right? I mean, these kind of disasters can happen. So, fair bit of sort of coverage and stuff out there. And again, these are the designs and all. I mean, if you just guide this first author, Todd Humphrey, he gave a talk almost a year, just about a year ago, in our EE seminar series. So pretty interesting. Yeah.
Do all the GPS models come with separate channels for civilian and?
No. Only military channels have military thing. Yeah. The civilians one don't, because they depend upon a secret key, which obviously you don't have. So civilian GPS receivers just have it. You are welcome to design a receiver to listen on the military channel, but since you don't have the key, you won't get anything out of it.
You can still Meacon with it though, right? If you're just relying on the signal.
You could Meaconing on it, yes. You could Meaconing on it. And I think that's what these guys did show, not in this paper, but I was reading another article that apparently you could do a Meaconing attack on military channels as well. Yeah. Okay, so there are some interesting kind of more readable articles kind of out there.
One more question. So, if let's say someone wants to get a hold of a military one that was maybe, I don't know, lost or crashed or whatever, do they change the keys up regularly so that you can't just keep using that one? If you're not on the pattern, you can't use it anymore?
I'm pretty sure that is based around public key crypto systems and also that they're immune to, like, you can revoke that your keys are for some particular sections and stuff like that. Yeah. But having said that, things do go awry, right? So I think it was 2016 during one of the satellite firmware update, some glitch happened, and there were regions of UK which were severely affected where the time, the particular, so firstly, lots of things had wrong location, but things which were dependent on time crashed, including radio stations and some utility grids and stuff like that, while and it lasted for a few hours until they discovered that. So I think the human errors can also sort of cause issues again. So the Cornell slash now UT Austin work, I mean, they kind of describe their whole hardware and all. It's pretty vanilla stuff which you can build. You can even do using USRP or kind of any other higher end thing. These signals are in roughly 1.4, 1.5 gigahertz frequency range. Yeah, so not that bad in terms of when it comes to being able to play with them. Now, having said that, when there are bad guys and there are good guys, so I also see now people advertising spoofer busters and things like that. I mean, so essentially letting you detect things. And I suspect, I mean, they're probably implementing some of the mechanisms that both the Austin group and also the 880 group had described in recent years. Essentially, to combat, so there are two ways of thinking about this, right? One is a redesign of the GPS system where even for the civilian channels you do use authentication mechanisms and stuff like that, and sort of in a way we do know how to go around doing it, right? I mean, the only problem is that this is not a clean slate system. You are suddenly not going to revoke access to everything out there. So at some stage that kind of redesign might happen. For now, you really have an anomaly detection problem, right? Is something weird going on? Am I under a spoofing attack? Am I under a Meaconing attack? And fundamentally, these things then rely on having some source of trust which you arrange. And there are kind of two ways, really. One is some other sensor which you know adversary cannot compromise. And even if it's a less accurate sensor, it can at least begin to bound the attack. So it can detect gross. So could you think of, for location purposes, some other source of information that you can use to detect you're under attack? The goal is to bound. If you can detect the attack, then you can discard that information and rely on something else. Huh? Okay, cellular information, yeah, cellular, Wi-Fi, these sort of things. So they are, the only thing is they are also amenable to exactly the same kind of attacks, Meaconing, jamming, and stuff like that. So is there any other way you can think of tracking location without relying on wireless? Okay, current city. So I think the user has to be utterly ignorant. Now, having said that, the issue is the following. How does a UAV know which city it is in? Right? I mean, we humans have knowledge. UAVs, I guess, I mean, yeah. So you could imagine maybe it could use its own built-in sensors, cameras, matching them against things. Yeah.
Well, they do. So UAVs also have like a camera-based navigation system where they're looking
Right.
for features on the ground.
Features on the ground. You can use inertial sensors. That's another possibility, right? So there are other sensors against which you can cross-check, and that would be kind of general strategy that you do. Another one is, other way of forming trust is through diversity, okay, which is having multiple sensors or looking at a whole bunch of satellites or looking at multiple satellite systems and then deriving your location. So usually through some combination of these techniques, you would begin to bound what is happening. It kind of takes care of gross, very gross or large attacks which are seeking to manipulate you. I mean, suddenly if my GPS says I'm in New York, then yeah, there's a problem. I'll know it. But if the GPS shows that instead of being in this building, I'm in the neighboring building, that's much harder to detect, obviously, right? So there are limits to it. The final vector of attack on GPS that has been shown is exploiting receiver software bugs. So remember, the receiver software, like any other sensor, is also receiver, like any other sensor, are usually another embedded system. They have firmwares and they suffer from all the same issues which bedevil embedded systems. They are resource constrained and usually they are running deep down some operating system, which again would have its own long list of bugs and stuff like that. So you could exploit those. So there was a work out of CMU and a company, that paper, which kind of was showed that receivers out on the market have lots of such bugs that kind of exist. So one example, so the basic approach out here is the following. Unlike other sensors, let's say a radar or something, which looks at natural waveforms, GPS is in a way not a sensor which is relying on sort of very specific information content which is in that wireless waveforms, right? So it's a communication system also. So you can manipulate its content of that data, those data bits, and then manipulate the inference that the receiver is making. So the idea is by broadcasting fake GPS messages, whose structure now is designed not to spoof, not to manipulate the bits so that the receiver calculates a wrong location, those spoofing can do, but rather exploit bugs in the receiver software very much along the way we exploit software bugs, causing buffer overflows or feeding values which we know that the software cannot handle properly. So one attack that they showed was called middle of earth attack, and kind of the idea was that you fake the GPS signal so that some positions in there, I think the position of the satellite, something, are reported to be one of the coordinates is reported to be 0, and then apparently these guys can only speculate because the software is known. They speculated that it causes a divide by zero exception, and then the receiver reboots, and so they cause the receiver to enter into an infinite cycle of reboots by sending this thing. Okay, so it's a denial of service. There are paper also has a whole bunch of other attacks which are exploiting other different kind of issues that exist in the receiver software. So this is kind of another interesting attack vector that you are actually receiving bits, and those bits can affect the state of the software, and therefore that's the okay. So that's GPS. So GPS can be, as I said, can be attacked, and I guess right now, really by and large, the only thing preventing it is the threat of penalty, but which again is not going to hold back someone who's intent on mounting an attack, right? I mean, yeah. So for terrorists, it doesn't really sort of hold much. And when it comes to protecting against this, like I said, eventual solution will have to be that the infrastructure has to be designed more robustly, signals which are signed, signals which are encrypted, at the very least signed. So encryption is less important, but digital authentication will be. The other type of attacks is attacks which can be mounted, attacks which can be mounted on the sensors that exist in the car as the car drives on the road and is trying to look around the road, right? So I mean, these are radars and ultrasonic sensors and cameras and LIDARs and these kind of things which we are increasingly seeing getting deployed in cars for ranging from things like just distance as you're backing up or pulling in, to sort of side sensors for lane change kind of assist, keeping you in the lane, and all the way to some degree of autonomous driving. And there are kind of three kind of attacks papers normally kind of describe for this thing. There are attacks that they call as front, rear, side type attacks, and kind of the idea here is that another car behind you or next to you is the one where the adversary is located, and it's therefore mounting an attack. And there is a degree of persistence that they can bring to it because they could drive with you and cause. Roadside attacks, that is attacks which are mounted from roadside structure, maybe from some household or someone just leaves something in an intersection causing chaos. And then finally, so-called evil mechanic attack, which is for the, or I would also put into an evil valet attack, right? I mean, so someone who you trusted with access to the car misuses it and mounts these kind of attacks. Okay, so several papers at Black Hat and some of the conferences in recent times have gone after these attacks. So there are so-called blinding attacks on the cameras that people have shown. So these are, I mean, conceptually very simple, and like usually the thing in these papers is that they systematically study the process. I'm pretty sure if I told you about a sensor and tasked you to attack them, you'll come up with similar things. So for cameras, kind of the obvious one comes up is to fool the camera, you shine light on it, blind the camera basically, right? Much like you will blind a human. It turns out, and they do this thing using lasers, and essentially they mess the control system based upon that. In the same way, instead of blinding attack, another type of attacks which rely on the fact that these cameras are designed to have various automatic control things behind it. What I mean by that is they may have automatic white balance control, automatic exposure control, these kind of things, much like we see it in our regular cameras, right? The thing is, a lot of these systems take time to recover. So while it is true that a persistent blinding light might be then detected by the human and who can then take an evasive action, imagine there was a pulse, and that causes an issue because it essentially blinds the camera for a teeny bit. The human doesn't notice, but the recovery time for the camera is significant enough to cause issues. So Mobileye is the Israeli company who's is now part of owned by Intel, but their cameras are kind of basically modules are dominantly used. So these guys kind of studied those. Tricking LIDARs in the car. So LIDARs are being extensively used in a lot of these pilots which are being done. The Google car, the Uber car, and all these ones are heavily dependent upon LIDARs. And now I think one of the Audis A8, I think, is using a LiDAR. And so first sort of mass scale vehicle doing it. The basic idea in LiDARs is that they're kind of like radar but using laser. So they shoot a laser and they look at the bounce back signal, and then they develop what is called as a point cloud map, which is they're basically developing things like what are the solid objects out there and kind of in the scene that they are doing. So they acquire kind of measurements on points from which sort of reflection happen, and they look not only the direct signal, but the signal kind of will get bounced around a bit before coming back in. So so there's some sort of complicated processing needs to be done to kind of do this thing. So there are variety of attacks possible here also. So one is again the blinding attack. This paper Korea calls it a saturation attack or a dazzle attack as they call it. The idea, like I said, is that you shine a bright laser. What helps is that these LiDARs are designed to use infrared. So when you're shining things and all, we are not seeing anything. Okay, they are out of our visible range. And the other thing is, it turns out that because of all these reflections and the fact that these LiDARs have kind of it's not like they're a point sensors. They kind of have a curved sort of lens in front, and they gather sort of return signal from a wider angle. So it ends up resulting in a lot of fake points being sensed by the sensor. Second type of attack is a spoofing attack, much like we saw in GPS and wireless generally. So they call it illusion attack, but basically the idea is receive, delay, and send back. So it's a Meaconing attack on the, strictly speaking, it's a Meaconing attack. Yeah, again, you can generate multiple fake points and all. And so these guys had attacked, I think it was one of the Mercedes which had a LIDAR that they had attacked. And finally, to end this thread, there's a paper last year which sought to attack drones by again manipulating their sense of orientation or position. And in this particular case, they made use of the fact that besides GPS and stuff like that, these drones rely on IMUs, inertial sensing units, which basically sense acceleration, gyro, and magnetic field. So 9 degrees of freedom. And then they are used in the inner control loop. The GPS location are used by the drones for kind of coarser scale movement, and then this is used for the actual flight control. So they sought to attack those. Now their work was kind of driven by something that I pointed out in the introductory lecture, that the group out of Stanford and some others have shown that accelerometers and gyros can be triggered by sound waves, and they were using as a privacy vehicle, kind of like a microphone. But kind of these guys explored the idea that, okay, what if that sound is very loud? Can I now cause these things to perturb enough so that they report incorrect readings? So while this paper got a lot of attention and lots of media articles and high profile places and all, but the actual paper is a bit of a letdown in a way. So what these guys did was they mounted Bluetooth speaker on the drone and played the sound through that. So you're basically right there. And then they showed that they can indeed tamper with. They could, in some drones, they just crashed. Okay, so the moment the attack was mounted. The problem, though, is in the rest of the paper, obviously, if I'm an adversary and I'm going to physically mount a somewhat largish Bluetooth speaker on your drone, there are it's probably easily detectable, so not a very interesting attack, if you may. So what about attack from a distance? So there things begin to fall apart rather rapidly, because you basically, even if you are in open space, you are fighting against a quadratic signal decay there. So your sound wave has to be kind of really, really loud. So these guys firstly didn't do any real experiments to show anything. But they did some calculations, and then they kind of showed that if I had a directional speaker which gave a 140 dB of sound pressure level at 1 meter distance, then at a 37-meter distance from a drone, they would be able to bring the drone down or not affect the thing. So that's their claim. For some reason, they haven't done any evaluation of that claim with a lab or actual drone. So just take it with a big grain of salt. So I think this is one of those papers where it was newsworthy, and I guess that perhaps played a big role in it getting the attention it did. But I think from a purely technical perspective, I would be a bit suspect. I bring out this thing because as you read the papers that we are, try to think about these things, right? I mean, is the evaluation really substantiating the claim? What are the weaknesses? Are there anomalies in the evaluation that should have been caught? No conference and no paper is perfect. There are lots and lots of false positives in terms of papers which get in but really have serious issues. So think about some of those aspects. But in any case, remotely attacking sensors and thereby manipulating the sense of state that a device has, a vehicle has, is another vector. So what we saw in kind of across implant in this is that you largely basically have three attack vectors, right? One is the good old software vector. That is, most of these devices are designed to ingest bits, either data bits or bits of code because you're doing a firmware upgrade. And therefore, if you can compromise that, you can attack these devices. Second vector is that these things communicate, and given their very nature, oftentimes they communicate wirelessly, and therefore attacks on the wireless link. And attacks on the wireless link can be used to, again, firstly corrupt the data bit, so kind of partially overlaps with the first one. And then another thing is if the device is relying on physical characteristics of the wireless communication, namely delay or something like that, you can affect the sense of location or time or stuff like that. So that's the second attack. And the third attack vector is attacking sensors, right? So manipulating these other physical waveforms that are being ingested by the device through these sensors, and we can whatever jam them, we can blind them, or we can do other sort of manipulation or spoofing of those signals. So that's kind of the state of. Now, of course, where attacks happen, defense also happens. So the other body of work, which we'll cover in a later lecture, has started to look into how can I design sensing systems, machine learning systems, or control systems which are robust to such attacks on sensing. And the related one is how can I design sensors which are robust to this. So for example, let's look at LIDAR or camera. Let's look at the camera, right? So how could you think of approaches where you can design the camera so that it is robust, more robust to spoofing attacks, more robust to the dazzling, or let's look at a LIDAR. Okay, so in case of LIDAR, they were doing, let's look at the spoofing attack or delay attack. What kind of things we could do to kind of catch the adversary, or at the very least detect? So ideal would be that, well, I guess the ideal would be that I'm robust to the adversary in the sense that adversary cannot tamper with my reading, but at least the next best thing would be that can I detect. So let's think about a camera, standard camera. Are there ways you can think of where you can be more trusting of the signal that is coming back for LIDAR? How? So I can have redundancy in sensors, right? So not redundancy of signals, but I can have redundancy of sensors. I can have multiple sensors, and perhaps I could do them in a manner that the adversary cannot lie meaningfully to all of them simultaneously. Either cannot jam them or lie meaningfully to all of them, right? I mean, so that's one possibility. I can have multiple sensors positioned such that they essentially increase the complexity for the adversary tremendously, right? To be able to mount kind of attack. Okay, so that's one. What else? How do you protect wireless signals generally? I mean, I think all of you are EEs. Last I saw in the enrollment. Okay, so I'm pretty sure you. How do we make wireless communication robust against jamming? Anyone?
Sends back what you send out. Like
Usually that doesn't work because what you're sending out is so loud that you will be dazzled by your own signal. It's very hard to do. Think modulation. Are there modulation schemes that make the job of the adversary harder?
frequency hopping.
Yeah, spread spectrum, right? I mean, that's the good old technique of essentially. I mean, you're making your signal either very low but spread out, so that's direct sequence spread spectrum, or frequency hopping. In fact, frequency hopping was created entirely for security purposes. So kind of we hop around and kind of. Who invented it? It's kind of a low, kind of an interesting story. That's why I'm asking. Who invented it? be some pretty smart person, right? It was actually a Hollywood actress in late 1930s, Heidi Lamar. So if you Google for invention spread spectrum, you'll kind of find that. Okay, so yeah. So anyway, that's a digression of sorts, but so you can spread the signal, right, to make the wireless signal inherently more. In essence, so why is now there the idea is protecting against jamming and eavesdropping. But if you think about it, the real underlying thing is what's the secret? What's the secret sauce? Why is the adversary not able to snoop on me in a spreaded signal, a frequency hopping signal? Right. The adversary doesn't know the hopping sequence, right? It's a shared secret between me and my receiver. In fact, the military uses kind of synchronized pieces of hardware and then send out, and they then operate on some keypad to kind of hop. Okay. So that means embedded in my signal is some secret which I know, and therefore I can validate, but the adversary cannot. And that's the general idea behind any sort of a lot of these security mechanisms rely on some sort of secret. So now the reason it works is that we control the signal to some extent. We are not just passively observing the world. We are sending out a signal and then we are observing that signal, either I or some other part, right? So you can take this basic idea and apply it in a lot of settings. So if you're simply passively observing the world as is, the naturally emitted signal from the world, and then trying to make an inference is going to be very hard. But if you shine light on the world and look at the return light, then you have some hope, because you can embed in that light, embed in that wave, some secret which should be present in a valid thing which is coming back, right? And so you can imagine doing it for LIDAR. No reason that the laser cannot carry some sort of secret, so to say. Radars do it all the time. That's how you kind of try to detect decoys or attempts to spoof. You can do in acoustic domain. So really kind of you can try to make the sensors more robust by firstly active sensing, that is, don't trust anything that originates from the outside entirely, because you have no control over it. So you have to establish trust by sending something out and then looking at the return signal. That's kind of a principle that perhaps is reasonably kind of. So wherever is a source of the signal, if you cannot trust it, you're opening up some. That's the problem with GPS, because the GPS signals are not being signed, so therefore the adversary can kind of come into play. But the same kind of basic approach can work for a lot of things. Okay, so it's 5 p.m. Let's stop for a few minutes, and then I don't know, Yinsen, you would go first. Okay. So let's do a 5-minute break while we transition over.